What's up, everybody? I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down, hanging out with an Academy Award winner, Roger Ross Williams. What's up, man? How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to be talking to you.
Great to be talking to you.
So I'm really excited for this project because you're involved with it. We got Liz Garbus, Alex Gibney, and of course, just the subject matter is really intense and really interesting. So how'd this all come together for you, the Innocence Files?
Yeah. Well, it was really started with Netflix. Netflix approached me and Alex and Liz, and I've admired the work of the Innocence Project for a long time. They do incredible work. They've gotten hundreds of people out of jail, exonerated, and so I jumped at the chance. I mean, for me, I was shocked that someone hadn't done this already, you know, because these stories are so powerful, and there's a happy ending at the end. There's a very positive emotional moment that happens at the end of these stories when someone's exonerated. You can't kind of beat that, like, emotionally.
I mean, it's unlike anything else. I've talked to a couple people who've been exonerated, and it's amazing just the journey they go on from going to prison for something they didn't do to having their whole lives change when they thought they'd be there for the rest of their lives. So what was it like unpacking those parts of the journey?
You know, it was tough emotionally. I direct the first 3 episodes, which most of that takes place in Mississippi, in Knoxville County, and it's a place with poor African-American community. Mostly everyone lives in trailers. You can feel the legacy of slavery all around you. And when I remember the first day when I sat down to talk to some of the residents there, they were playing a card game, and one of them said to me, white people make the laws and we just try to stay out of the way. And that's the attitude there. And when, with Levon Brooks, when he was convicted, he just gave up. He just gave up. He just said, oh, well, that's it. My life is over. I'm just going to give up. And he just sat there in prison for 18 years.
And then how did he first start the process in terms of trying to get his charges overturned?
It actually was, so he was convicted of murdering a 3-year-old girl. After he was convicted, 2 years later, another 3-year-old girl turns up dead in the exact same way. And another guy, Kennedy Brewer, gets convicted of that crime. And they didn't think, well, maybe they thought it's a copycat, but they didn't think that maybe the same person could have done those 2 crimes. It couldn't have been Levon because he was in prison. So Kennedy Brewer wrote a letter to the Innocence Project. And when Peter Neufeld, the founder of the Innocence Project, and his team got that letter, Peter was blown away. He said it was a very powerful letter. And with Kennedy Brewer, they had DNA evidence, and they did a DNA test, and his DNA was not on the victim. So he was exonerated. And when they started to look back through the possible suspects, they found someone who they had interviewed and sort of let go, and he ended up being the person. He confessed to both murders. Wow. Which got Levon Brooks out of prison. And we interviewed Levon. We rushed down because Levon got out of prison, and not too long after that, he got cancer. And we rushed down to interview him, and he since has passed away. And before we even sort of went into production on the Innocence Project, Jeff Martz, the series producer, he's like, we got to go down there and grab this. We just spent our own money and go down there because he's not well. And we got this really sort of powerful interview with him before he passed away. So after the injustice of his life, he ends up getting out and dying of cancer.
So how long was he out before he passes away?
He was out for a number of years, almost 10 years, I believe.
Gotcha.
He was out because they got him. Both him and Kennedy Brewer got $500,000, which was $50,000 a year, which was about to run out, and which, $50,000 a year, it's not that much. They didn't have any, and because they didn't qualify for Social Security because they hadn't worked their entire life, they were penniless. They had nothing.
What's the most fascinating part of all this to you? Because you talk about like the conversations locally going on in Mississippi, the criminal justice system, the Innocence Project. Like, what piques your interest the most in terms of peeling back the layers here?
I think, I come from a community not unlike the one in Mississippi, in Pennsylvania, and a lot of my friends and family are behind bars. I've made other films about the mass incarceration crisis in America. But what struck me about this was the way they used junk science to lock people up. I wasn't quite aware of how extensive and how all of this junk science had been disproven, and bite marks, which has been totally debunked, is still admissible in 49 states.
Wow.
So states don't want to debunk that, because then they would have a duty to correct. And that would open a can of worms. And lots of people have been convicted by bite mark evidence. So they would be really opening themselves up to a lot of, a lot of problems. So it's a huge injustice. And I think that, with this series, these stories are just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many people behind bars for crimes they didn't commit in the country that has the largest mass incarceration rate in the world, and 1 in every 3 Black men end up behind bars. So we're dealing with a huge crisis in the country, and hopefully this will open people's eyes about it, and people will care.
Yeah, I feel you. And the thing is, like with the Innocence Project, like they're amazing with what they do, but they can only take on so many cases. And there's so many people who never even get a chance to get to this part of the story.
Never get a chance. I mean, the Innocence Project gets thousands and thousands of letters. I mean, there are people sitting there, as you see in the series, they're just reading letters all day. And how do you decide which letter to take, which case to take on? It's so overwhelming. So it's, we have a huge crisis in America, and the crisis affects Black and brown people at a, extremely high rate. It has to do with racism. It has to do with the legacy of slavery. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you go down to Mississippi, when spending time there, it was amazing to me, because the Dr. West in the film, who's the odontologist who does the bite mark evidence that gets them convicted. When we first met him, he's sitting in his office surrounded by Confederate flags, and he puts his gun on the table, and he's like, they're trying to take away our history. They're trying to take away the Confederate statues. And he goes, they're trying to erase my history. They're trying to erase what I've done. And he believes, that he's done nothing wrong, but the science that he's based his career on is debunked.
That's crazy. Especially with the Confederate flags and even just conversations about that, like the fact that some people can't see the racism and what that flag represents and just look at it as some sort of nationalistic pride is really mind-boggling, but it's not surprising when you spend time in the South. It's
not. I mean, LaVon Brooks, who was the first one convicted in my 3 hours, the foreman of his jury was the family that owned the plantation where his father was a sharecropper.
Wow.
So LaVon Brooks and the foreman of the jury played together as kids. Plantation owner and Javon Brooks and his family lived in a shack on the plantation. And before that, they were the slaves of this family. So the slave-owning family and the foreman of the jury, he puts away, he felt terrible. He's like, he loved LaVon. He grew up with LaVon, and he puts away, his childhood friend who worked for his family and was owned by his family. Look at that. Like, that's
crazy.
That's crazy stuff.
Yeah. You mentioned the fact that you've been covering this throughout your career. I mean, we've seen some projects recently, like the Brian Banks movie telling his story, For Life, the new show on ABC about a wrongful conviction. Do you think people care more now? Like, I just want to put it bluntly, because people still need to care more, but do you feel like the stories are being told in a better way?
Um, you know, I don't think there's enough. There can't be enough because it's such a huge injustice. I think that, um, stories like the Central Park Five and the success of it helps. People are becoming more informed, but people still, they're worried about their daily lives and putting food on the table. They're not necessarily thinking about all the people that are rotting away in prison for crimes they didn't commit. They're not even thinking about even so much about the mass incarceration problem and the role that race plays in that. So it can't get enough attention as far as I'm concerned. There can't be enough films. I think because everyone is sort of sitting at home right now, they can hopefully they'll all tune in and watch the Innocence Project, and they'll be you can't help but be moved. You can't help but get angry watching these stories. You're like, what? You can't believe that that these stories even happened. And so hopefully that'll open people's eyes and that'll affect legislation. I think there's bipartisan efforts now in Congress, and we have even people like Kim Kardashian out there having a conversation with President Trump, and actually there is a conversation going on about it. So let's got to be hopeful, right?
Yeah, no, anything to get this conversation in the mainstream. It's not the typical players, but you know what? We need the conversation, and you've been having the conversation for a really long time, and you won the first Academy Award for a Black director, which is an unbelievable accomplishment. What do you remember about that night?
Well, not a lot. I mean, it's a out of body experience. I couldn't believe that I was the first Black director to win an Academy Award. There's so many, Spike Lee and John Singleton and all these incredible directors that came before, and that says something about the Hollywood, about the industry, and I've been working hard to try to change that. I'm now on the board of governors of the Academy, which means I'm one of the governors. I represent the documentary branch of the Academy and sit on a board with Spielberg and all the other governors, and it's really and I head up the diversity division, diversity committee in the Academy, and there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done in the documentary community, much more than work. And the documentary community is so much more diverse than actual Hollywood or the Academy itself. So we're ahead of the curve in the doc world, but we still have a lot of work to do. So I'm taking it on.
Well, Roger, you've done amazing work. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you down the road, all right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.